Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Paul. I will be giving a talk about banking security in general and mobile banking security in particular. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. It's always an honor to be able to talk to some colleagues at an event like this, and a nice occasion to reflect back on some work that I've been doing. Before I start my talk, I want to express my sympathy to the people in Ethiopia. It's been really sad to hear all the terrible news of the violence there. I hope you and your loved ones and your friends there are all safe, and that the situation will improve soon. So I want to take a bit of a wide look at payment solutions and banking solutions and things that have gone wrong in the past and how they have been improved. So I've been following developments in internet banking and payment systems here in the Netherlands for over 10 years now, where first we had magnetic stripe cards, but they were quickly replaced by bank cards with a chip. We saw the success of internet banking here in the past decade. And in more recent years, sort of the traditional chip cards, they have also been used for contactless payments, which is sort of now the norm if I go into a shop to buy something. And in recent years, we've also seen the advent of the use of mobile phones, both for mobile banking and for payments. So you have apps on your mobile phone to do the banking, and you can use your mobile phone in shops. And that's actually using the same mechanism here in the Netherlands as the contactless cards are using. So the mobile phones have really been a game changer here. So one thing that I noticed is that there's sort of a blurring distinction between what used to be sort of internet banking or online banking, which you used to do on your laptop at home on the one hand, and then doing payments in a shop on the other hand. If I'm using my mobile phone for both these operations at home, the distinction becomes a bit blurred. Another big difference has been the way that identity management works. So traditionally, banks do their identity management by handing out bank cards to their customers, but doing identity management by sort of getting people to have an app installed on their phone is very different. And finally, there have been some new developments, and it's sort of difficult to see how this will evolve. So here in the Netherlands, I've seen that in some shops where they just have a few fixed items at fixed price that they sell, they can use a QR code for payments, so that the payment terminal is disappeared, and we're using all the functionality that you can have in a mobile phone to scan a QR code, and then you're basically using internet banking to pay the shop. But of course, you can also think of other solutions where maybe the phone is used as a relatively dumb device, as a QR code or as a barcode. Here, of course, the developments in Africa have been very different, because in Africa you have systems like M-Pesa, which have been very successful, which in Europe we have not really seen, or not really seen yet. So my own interest as a computer scientist is really in the technology. So I've looked at, how do these systems work, reverse engineering them if this is not publicly available, and then trying to look for security flaws and using formal methods to analyze these protocols. So we made models of the EMV protocol that's used by bank cards, and we tried to make state machine models of, for instance, internet banking tokens to look for security flaws. But of course, criminals are not in it because they think computer science is interesting. They just want to attack the system. So what you often see is that criminals resort to much more low-tech attacks, and not sort of the really fancy stuff that we as computer scientists find interesting. But maybe to go back to the first cases where here in the Netherlands, I came across lots of fraud with payment systems, and this was actually quite advanced technical fraud. So was with skimming. So 10, 15 years ago, sort of ATMs in the Netherlands still used a magnetic stripe on the back of your bank card to retrieve your account information. And this information is easy to copy, and the technology to copy this is not different than an old-fashioned video recorder. So criminals were tampering with payment terminals or ATMs rather, to install fake keyboards to intercept the PIN code, and fake covers with magnetic stripe readers, so that they could make copies of the cards that were used at an ATM, and then make a cloned card to then withdraw money. So this was quite a big problem, and it was quite a big fraud, which is rapidly rising also, but which eventually was brought under control. And there is this very small residue of these attacks, which is in some overseas holiday resorts where they are still using magnetic stripes, and they are still cloning them. But there's several ways that the problem has been brought under control. And the first is, which is often the case in security, is not just by better technology to prevent problems, but to have better detection and reaction. So banks were quicker to spot that cards had been cloned, and that criminals were withdrawing large amounts of cash with cloned cards, to then block cards. So this is was really a way to not to prevent the fraud, but at least to drastically reduce the cost. This is, for instance, why you can see that in 2010 the costs or the cost of the fraud sort of halved, but then you see that the criminals got better again. But then there was also a piece of technology that was introduced to reduce fraud, and this was the magnetic replacing the magnetic stripe by the EMV chip. I'll discuss in a minute. And finally, to really stop the fraud was the use of what's called geo-blocking. So this would be that your bank card would by default be disabled to be used abroad, and then especially abroad in countries that are still using the magnetic stripe. So the EMV technology is what most chip cards use for banking, and it's actually also used if you use your mobile phone with the NFC interface in the shop to do a payment with your mobile. And it uses the standard cryptographic technique that of a challenge response mechanism where to authenticate the card. And this makes it impossible to eavesdrop on communication and to clone cards. Now, does this introduction of the chip help? So this is some fraud figures from the UK. And there you see that when they introduced EMV in 2006, that the fraud really dropped significantly, although there was still some fraud, presumably because there were still some magnetic stripe terminals out there. But what you saw at the same time was that fraud abroad was skyrocketing, because criminals could still make a copy of a magnetic stripe in the UK and then go to some other country, say the Netherlands, where they were still using the magnetic stripe, and then withdraw money there. So the next step then was that cards would be blocked for countries that would still be using the magnetic stripe by default. And that really cut down fraud a lot. So after most of Europe started using the magnetic stripe, you saw that stopped using the magnetic stripe. You saw that the criminals actually moved to the US. So the US was still using the magnetic stripe everywhere, so that criminals could use their skimming technology there. So the US has now largely finished migrating to using the EMV chip too, except maybe at petrol pumps. So then the criminals will have to find another way to find money. So what you see here, this is a sort of a recurring effect that I see in security, is that yeah, so if you introduce some security measure, you don't really reduce the problem, but you shift it elsewhere. And of course, you shift it away from yourself. So it's in the short term, this is a solution, but then in the long term, the criminals might be coming back for you. So this is the kind of technology that is still being used. And the one on the top right was, I think, retrieved from a Canadian petrol pump a few years ago. So, but this should be sort of end of business for this type of fraud. What you see is that since then the criminals have been resorting to very low-tech forms of fraud, typically phishing. So here in the Netherlands, like 4 or 5 years ago, there was a spate of attacks where people were getting emails or even physical mail asking them to return their bank cards with their PIN code to the post. And it seems like a really silly attack that people might not fall for, but in practice it turns out that some people are really easy to fool. And criminals are very creative, right? So they something that you see recurring is that whenever the system becomes too secure, the attackers will target the end user and try to do some social engineering attack to trick them into revealing or giving them their bank card in this case. So the next big problem with digital banking infrastructure we saw in the Netherlands was with internet banking. Around 10 years ago, there was a really skyrocketing amount of fraud with internet banking. And again, you sort of see the same situation, that sort of the fraud skyrockets and then it's sort of brought under control. Again, it was largely due to monitoring, so the banks were getting much better at reporting suspicious transactions and blocking them, so to prevent criminals stealing money, using some of the cases I'll show later. And for the criminals, it's really a bottleneck to, if they do fraud on internet banking, to extract the money from the system, right? So they can set up, they can maybe trick people into transferring money into their bank account, but they don't want to be caught, so they have to use the bank account of a money mule, and then actually getting withdrawing money from an ATM can actually be the bottleneck for them, and the bank will be spotting money mules, sort of suspicious account where a lot of money suddenly ends up, and then blocking them. So as I said, for criminals, this was actually the most labor-intensive part of the work, finding people that whose bank accounts they could use to sort of launder the money. Of course, they did awareness campaigns, and I guess that it was maybe later that criminals also switched to ransomware as being a better business model. Some of the attacks on internet banking were really high tech, and you could imagine sort of similar attacks on mobile banking. So an attack that caused a lot of damage here in the Netherlands was actually a man in the browser attack, where there was malware on your computer inside your browser, which was reporting fake information. In this case, the fake information was that if you looked in your banking overview on the website, you would see that somebody had been paying you money, and then you had a phone call from the bank saying that this was a mistake, that somebody who started a new job had given the wrong bank account, so they were paying their salary into your bank account by mistake, and then they would be asking you very kindly to transfer the money back. And then some people actually did this, but then of course it turned out that this transaction you saw was fake. But then when you transferred the money back, that was not fake, and it ended up with the criminal. Another attack that we've seen is what's called SIM swapping. Some banks will be using them, even if you did online banking with your laptop, say, they would still be using SMS messages to authenticate you, so that every time you wanted to do a transaction, you had to request a new message via SMS. And this was attacked by a SIM swapping attack, where criminals would get a SIM card for your phone number, so that they would also be receiving these messages. And typically the way that this was done was by bribing somebody at a telecom shop to give out a SIM card on somebody else's phone number, as they can do. I think this attack actually originates from South Africa. There have also been reports of people hacking the mobile phone to then intercept these SMS messages on the mobile phone. But for the attacker, this is probably more work. So in the Netherlands, then the banks, then actually as a countermeasure, they also wanted to do better detection again. So if a telco, the banks would have deals with telecom operators that if a telecom operator would give a new SIM card on a number, that the banks would then initially block payments on these new SIM cards until they were convinced that it was actually the SIM card was reissued to their genuine customer. Another example of a more low-tech attack on internet banking that we've seen here is with fake web shops. Now you can of course have sort of normally a fake web shop or people using something like eBay to sell you a product but then not deliver the product. But here the criminals were a bit more creative, so they would be advertising, say, iPhones at a very low price or a slightly lower price than usual, and then people would be ordering them and then paying online and then never receiving the iPhone, of course. Now normally this kind of fraud would then lead back to the bank account of the criminal, but here the criminals were very creative, so that at the time they were selling some item in their shop, say for 200 euros in their online shop. At the same time, they would be buying 200 euros worth of Bitcoin at a web shop that sells Bitcoin. And then they would be forwarding the requests to the bank, to the victim, so that at the moment that you were thinking that you thought that you were transferring 200 euros to a criminal, you were actually buying the criminals 200 euros worth of Bitcoins. Of course, this is interesting for the criminals, because then if the bank, of course, customers would complain to the bank, and the bank would then look for the where the money went, but then it would actually end up with a legitimate web shop that was selling Bitcoin. So they would not be able to trace the money back to the criminal. And then the root cause of this attack is that that when people do online payments on their mobile phone, that the messages that you would get would not be very informative. So often you're transferring money to some payment processor, and then it's not so clear to you whether you're buying an iPhone or whether you're buying Bitcoins. So that was something that they improved in the user interface to make it a bit more informative for clients. Another solution was that they had again better monitoring, and also that they were the banks would actually impose extra rules for Bitcoin shops and online casinos that were also used for this kind of thing, and maybe prevent them from allowing internet payments. Now, in the past few years, we've seen in the Netherlands, most of the problems with internet banking have been with internet banking in the web browser, and not with mobile payment solutions on your mobile phone. It's not really clear why this is the case. I mean, in the same way, okay, some of the attacks that I just discovered would work with either solution, but it seems that for the criminal, it's easier for you to say send phishing emails to send you to get you to go to a fake a website. So this was with the first attack that I previously discussed. And another thing is that sort of if an attacker can find a problem with a web browser, that there's many ways of making money out of this. Whereas all the banks will be using their own apps, so that attacks are much more targeted. So doing an attack on an app is a lot of work. And then also because the apps are updated frequently, if you find a security weakness in an app, you need a shelf life of exploiting that vulnerability would be a much shorter. We have seen sort of a second wave in the past few years on attacks on mobile banking. At least that was also targeting the app, and then it was mainly with phishing. So you see that in the first wave of attacks on online banking was still criminals used a lot of malware, but nowadays it's mainly phishing. And then it's different forms of phishing. One of them is where criminals actually phone victims, and then they try to get access code. So most of the banks in the Netherlands still use one of these devices where you have to authenticate with your with some reader and in your bank card, for instance, when you install your app on a mobile phone. And then if the criminals can trick you in this way, then the criminals can install the app on their phone. And what's been more popular in the past few years, and that's in other European countries as well, is sort of WhatsApp scams, where somebody sends messages pretending to be like your mother or your daughter or a friend, and then they try to trick you into transferring money to them. Right, then you get a message saying, I desperately need some cash, can you lend me some? And then people transfer money, but then it's actually to somebody else. So if you compare the security that's offered by smartphones with smart cards, what you see here is that on the one hand, a stolen phone can be harder to use than a stolen card if you need a biometric, like a fingerprint or your face recognition to unlock it. So there is still some cases here in the Netherlands where people are robbed. So pickpockets steal a bank card of somebody after they've been shoulder surfing, so that they know the bank card, so they have the bank card and they know the PIN code, and then they can, say, withdraw people's life savings. So in that sense, mobile phones can be more secure. Another reason that the banks report that mobile phones are more secure is that people nowadays notice it very quickly that our mobile phone is stolen. And if they then report that the mobile phone is stolen, then the payments from that mobile phone can be blocked. So the banks are finding that they have fewer cases where people don't report something stolen and they cannot block the payments. So that's another sort of unexpected way, maybe in which phones turn out to be more secure than smart cards. I would like to draw some more general conclusions that I've seen over the years. So as an academic researcher, I've always been sort of focusing on the technical security flaws in systems. But what you actually notice is that sometimes there is a technical flaw in the system, but then there's no interesting way for attackers to exploit it, or if they exploit it, the money will be traceable to them, and so they will get caught quickly, or they can only make a little limited amount of money before they get the police after them. So there is a big difference between having technical flaws and actually having a security risk. So another thing that you see is that especially if the technical security of devices or payment systems becomes better, that criminals typically focus on sort of the low-tech social engineering flaws. And this seems to be inevitable that if we get the cybersecurity, if we improve it, the criminals will simply target the users. And a recurring theme here in attacks is phishing, as I have mentioned in several instances. And I think here in computing science, we structurally overlook a problem. So authentication is really important for IT security, but we're typically thinking about authentication of the user. So if you see a lot of banking technology, like your bank card, or using these banking tokens that we use here in the Netherlands for internet banking, their goal is that that the user can authenticate to the bank. So the bank wants to make sure that they're really talking to you if they're doing payments, or if they're doing bank transfers. But what's sort of structurally overlooked, not just in banking systems, but also in other IT systems, is the authentication by the user. So does the user know that they're really talking to the bank? And this is, of course, what phishing attacks target. So they try to trick the user into thinking that they're talking to the bank when they're talking to a criminal on the phone, or when they're talking to a fake web shop, or to a fake banking site. So yeah, as I mentioned before, I think this is a recurring problem, that this is really a challenge that we have to tackle wider in IT to make cybersecurity better. So a recurring theme that I see in protecting systems is that the focus is always on better detection and response. So in most ITs in most systems, we tend to focus on preventing fraud, but often having very good detection and very good response is maybe just as good. So if I look back historically, and if I look at the attacks that we've seen on the internet banking systems, a lot of the improvements have been found by having a better detection and better response. And then typically, if you look at the fraud cases, it typically goes in like in a picture like this, that firstly the fraud rises very rapidly, and then it's brought under control by monitoring to not to zero, but to an acceptable level for the bank. So, and then the big challenge for the bank is then often not really preventing fraud, but preventing fraud where the money is extracted from the system before they can stop it, right? So if the fraud can be detected and the money is still saying in the criminal's bank account, then the banks can stop block that bank account of the criminal and refund the money. So in the Dutch banks, what I know is that what people are really looking for are sort of loopholes where people might be able to extract large amounts of money from the banks, which the bank can no longer get back. And this is also something I think where Bitcoin and other blockchain-based payment systems have a problem. The claim to fame of blockchain transactions is that you cannot roll them back. But from a security perspective, this is really unwanted, right? You really want to be able to roll back transactions if you know that there was fraud. So this might well be the Achilles heel of Bitcoin for everyday payments. So I haven't really mentioned this, but over the years in studying the various systems, we have sometimes noticed really silly security flaws in products, even in products that are really made by reputable vendors. So for instance, the internet banking tokens that we use for online banking in the Netherlands, they use the EMV cap standard, which is developed by MasterCard. And some variants of this standard really have silly mistakes in it. And some implementations of this in banking tokens have really silly mistakes in them. What's really strange is that sometimes in these systems it's not really clear who's taking responsibilities. In the past, I've seen that sometimes the banks will simply trust their suppliers to provide secure implementations of standards that MasterCard and Visa say have developed. Maybe these suppliers haven't really looked seriously at security. So I notice here in the Netherlands over the past 10 years, the banks have really been much more proactive in sort of now investigating the technology that they're using. So that this is something I see in general in security. There's often a lot of cover your ass security, where there is some official audit scheme where people tick some boxes to certify a product. But maybe this is just sort of some paper pushing exercise, and people are maybe not doing a really thorough job. And then the system is sold because it's a well-known company and it has a good reputation. But maybe then they still sell very insecure products. And finally, so when I started looking at banking security and payment security, I always had the idea, okay, these people have a hard time because criminals are really going to be targeting them. But in the end, I think sort of banking security is sort of easier than security in a lot of other cases. And the reason is that the banks, they can actually measure the fraud that there is. Okay, there is some noise in these figures, but they can get, if there a certain type of fraud increases, they can see it in their systems. And so I showed you these graphs where you saw some types of fraud going up and then brought under control. So the banks have a good idea of, okay, what are the dangerous attacks? And then if they introduce defenses, they can see if this makes a difference. So then they have a rational basis for investing in certain types of security. And I think in a lot of other industries, this is much, much harder. So if you think about sort of the protecting, say, the IT systems of a hospital or the IT systems of the electricity grid, it is much harder for these organizations to make rational decisions on how much to invest. I see in Europe, in the US, we see now a really booming business where criminals use ransomware, and of course, the ransomware is a really deplorable activity, but I think in a sense it has a useful role in educating some organizations in the value of their IT infrastructure. So once people have been hit and they've been forced to pay large amounts of money to some cyber criminal, then they will be better motivated for making maybe more investments into protecting the cybersecurity of these systems. So the sad conclusion that I see here is that, yeah, in most organizations, you really need big security problems to cause, yeah, real harm before people actually will take some action. Okay, thanks for your interest, and I hope the online presentation is working so that I will be able to face some of your questions.